December 18, 2022. A blood-soaked private jet makes an emergency landing in Athens. Sheikh Zayyan al-Bari, Dubai's most powerful oil magnate, is dead with a knife in his chest. His killer? A 26-year-old American woman who confesses immediately. But this wasn't a random act of violence. For 18 months, Kendra Hart had been trapped in a web of psychological manipulation orchestrated by a master predator. What started as a dream job in Dubai's glittering towers became a nightmare of control, lies, and broken promises. Tonight, we uncover how a billionaire's decades-long pattern of exploiting young women finally caught up with him at 35,000 feet. This is the story of how far someone will go when they discover their entire life was built on deception, and how one moment of rage destroyed 2 lives forever. Sheikh Zayyan al-Bari was a name known all over the big, sunny city of Dubai. His name meant power and control. At 70 years old, he had built a life that most people could only dream of. His life was full of wealth, special rights, and a quiet, strong kind of power. He was a perfect example of a rich man. He was deeply involved in Dubai's oil business. His money was invested all over the world, and he knew important people in royal and political circles. To everyone else, Zayyan's life looked like a perfect show, a beautiful time of wealth that few people could understand. His name was spoken with respect at private, fancy parties. When he entered a room, everyone became quiet, and his private jet had landed in every major city, from London to New York to Paris. His business empire was not just about oil. It reached into every part of the world's rich society. His big house in Dubai was amazing to look at, made of beautiful marble, glass, and gold. It showed how successful he was. Huge windows looked out over neat gardens where fountains sang a gentle song. Swimming pools glittered like they held 1,000 stars under the Arabian sun. Inside, every wall was decorated with the most expensive art. Every room and every piece of furniture showed his wealth. It was a life so far from normal that it seemed like a story. Zayyan had bought everything that money could get. But he had lost the most important thing, his home. The most important part of his public image was his family, which he had worked hard to create and keep perfect. Zayyan's marriage to Nawal, his wife of more than 40 years, was as big a part of his public life as his business deals. Together, they had 2 children, Faris, a smart and ambitious son who would take over the family business, and Zaina, a beautiful socialite with many admirers. To the world, they were the perfect family. In every picture, on every magazine cover, they stood together, smiling. They looked like the perfect portrait of a successful family. This image was flawless. But as the years passed, the marriage between Zayyan and Nawal became a beautiful, empty shell. It was a fake front that hid the deep sadness that had grown inside them. In the beginning, they had mutual respect and real affection. They were partners who shared big dreams. But as Zayyan's empire grew and he became more important, Nawal started to pull away from him. She became completely focused on the high society world she was expected to live in. This world was full of public appearances and endless social duties. The constant charity events, exclusive parties, and royal gatherings became her whole life. While Zayyan was the public face of their life, Nawal loved the praise of the rich elite. Her focus moved from her husband to the people she needed to impress. At dinner, Zayyan often felt like he was talking to a woman who wasn't really there. She would be thinking about the next party or the image she was so carefully creating. Zayyan's emotional and physical needs, which his wife once cared for, were now ignored. He wanted a simple touch, a connection that was more than just show. A real look, a real conversation, or the simple comfort of her hand in his. These things had become strange to him. He was a man whose life looked perfect on the outside, but his heart had never felt more alone. Nawal's neglect was a quiet pain, a constant feeling of loneliness in his life. His great wealth, his big success, his high status, none of it mattered if there was no one to share it with. In the quiet of his big house, Zayyan often found himself looking out at the city, feeling the huge weight of his loneliness. He had built a life of unbelievable luxury, but he was completely alone. And so his search began. He started looking for comfort somewhere else, not because he wanted to be a bad person, but because he had a desperate, growing need for a real connection that consumed his thoughts during the long, sleepless nights. The silence of his bedroom had become a prison of solitude. It was not the first time he had sought out a woman outside his marriage, but it was happening more and more often in recent years. each encounter a desperate attempt to fill the void that seemed to expand with every passing day. His affairs, while known in certain rich circles where whispered conversations carried more weight than newspaper headlines, were always kept private and controlled with military precision. He had learned to navigate these relationships with the same strategic thinking he applied to his business deals. The women he chose were usually younger, often working for his company or in his home as consultants who had access to his daily routine. They were temporary distractions, short moments of physical and emotional relief from the emptiness that his marriage could no longer fill, like brief rays of sunlight breaking through storm clouds before disappearing into gray obscurity. These women were just a way for him to feel something, anything that resembled the passion he had once known. None of them ever came close to meeting the deeper needs that bothered him during quiet moments of reflection, when he would sit in his study late at night, wondering how his life had become so hollow despite all his success. He used these women as tools to escape the suffocating silence of his home, the oppressive weight of unspoken disappointment that hung in the air, but none of them ever truly satisfied his deepest needs for authentic intimacy. Zayyan's desire for something real, something more than these empty connections, grew stronger every day like a physical hunger. The irony was not lost on him. He had everything that money could buy, yet he felt he had lost the most important thing of all. The real bond he had once shared with Nawal during their early years when they would stay up all night talking about dreams and ambitions. What had started as a very loving relationship had become nothing more than a symbol of their social status, a carefully maintained facade that required constant performance. In public, they continued to act like the perfect couple, their movements choreographed by years of practice, smiling for cameras at parties and posing with their children for magazine spreads. But behind closed doors, the silence between them was deafening, a vast chasm that widened with each passing day. It was a constant reminder of the empty space that grew every day, fed by unspoken resentments and unfulfilled expectations. Nawal would retreat to her private rooms, where she would busy herself with the latest fashion from Paris or immerse herself in organizing charity events that enhanced their social standing. Her days were filled with calls to designers and meetings with planners, keeping her mind occupied and leaving little time for difficult conversations their marriage desperately needed. Zayyan would stay in his mahogany-paneled study, surrounded by awards documenting his achievements, staring at his computer screen for hours, his mind full of frustration and loneliness that no professional success could alleviate. Their children, Faris and Zaina, were busy with their own lives, carrying on the family's legacy of success, but the cracks in the perfect family image were starting to show. Faris, who was a successful businessman on his own, often felt the heavy weight of his father's high expectations and pressure to maintain the family reputation. Conversations between father and son had become focused on business metrics, leaving little room for personal connection. Zaina, while she loved the attention that came with her position, started to feel trapped by the image she had to keep up. She had begun noticing the tension between her parents, the way they spoke with polite formality rather than warmth, making her question whether the life she was expected to embrace would satisfy her own need for happiness. But for Zayyan, it was Nawal's lack of attention that hurt the most, a pain that had settled deep in his chest. The woman who had once been his closest friend was now a distant figure, a stranger with his wife's face. She had become like beautiful art he could admire from afar but never truly possess. The more she pulled away, the more he wanted someone who could really see him, who could connect with him not because of his wealth, but because of who he was beneath the external trappings of success. He had spent his whole life building an empire, but all he wanted were simple things money couldn't buy, a real conversation lasting past midnight, genuine laughter not performed for an audience, someone who would choose his company even if he lost everything tomorrow. The realization that his wealth had become both his greatest asset and barrier to authentic connection was a bitter truth that kept him awake at night. His search for a distraction led him to a young event planner named Sophia who had recently joined his company with impressive credentials and infectious enthusiasm. At just 24, she was eager, smart, and hardworking, possessing energy that reminded him of his younger self before disappointment had settled on his shoulders. Her admiration for him was clear right away, evident in how she listened intently during meetings and asked thoughtful questions. She saw him as more than just a man with power. She saw him as a person with ideas that were worth listening to, shaped by real experience rather than theory. For the first time in a long while, Zayyan felt truly seen. Their relationship started as a work one, but as the weeks passed, their conversations became more personal. Sophia would laugh genuinely at his jokes, not the polite laughter he was accustomed to from people who wanted something, and give him compliments he hadn't heard in years from anyone who mattered. Her presence made him feel like the man he had once been, confident, interesting, worthy of attention. They started meeting outside of the office for dinners at quiet restaurants and trips to his private desert home, a secluded retreat where he could escape constant demands and scrutiny. In that peaceful setting, surrounded by sand dunes and star-filled skies, he could temporarily forget his disappointments, losing himself in conversations that stretched late into the night. He told himself it was just a temporary escape, but he couldn't deny how her youthful energy made him feel alive. But every time they said goodbye, the emptiness would return, sharper and more painful than before, like waking from a beautiful dream to find reality more disappointing. When Sophia left his company for a better job, the empty space was undeniable. She had been a quick fix, but she wasn't the solution. Still, the longing for that fleeting comfort was too strong to ignore. He found it again in Layla, a woman who was different from Sophia. She was more reserved and calm, possessing quiet strength that drew him gradually rather than overwhelming him immediately. Layla had an understanding of Zayyan that felt more real and grounded. She didn't just see him as a man of power. She listened to him and spoke to him like an equal, someone whose opinions mattered independent of his wealth. Their conversations were more meaningful than the ones he had with Sophia, covering business philosophy, politics, and family relationships. They spent hours talking, sharing perspectives that revealed true character rather than surface personalities. Layla's eyes were always steady when she looked at him, and she was never eager for his approval. She gave him something that Sophia never had, a real sense of understanding and acceptance. She made him feel like he wasn't alone, that he wasn't just a powerful figure to be admired from distance, but a complex human being worthy of genuine love. But even as their relationship grew deeper, Zayyan felt the warning signs. Layla, like Sophia, could never replace what he had lost with Nawal or fix the fundamental problems in his marriage. She was just another distraction, another temporary connection. He knew this, but the deeper he went, the harder it was to stop. The hollow ache inside him grew with every new meeting, and every time he returned to the coldness of his marriage, it became more unbearable. He was obsessed with the desire to feel anything other than the emptiness that had taken over his life. And as his frustration grew, he became more aware of the dangerous path he was on. He had looked for comfort in younger women, in short moments of passion, but none of them could replace what he had lost. His marriage, the foundation of his life, was breaking apart, and Zayyan was trapped in the painful realization that nothing he did could fix the fundamental emptiness at the center of his existence. Here enters Kendra Hart, a woman who never imagined that her life would take her to the fancy streets of Dubai. Growing up in Detroit, Michigan, her world was small and confined to gray industrial neighborhoods, but her goals were big and burning with intensity. Her mother, Celestine, cleaned offices at night, her hands raw from chemicals and her back aching from endless hours. Her father, Donovan, worked security at a downtown building, standing guard over other people's success, while his own remained distant. They were not rich by any measure, their apartment cramped and paychecks stretched thin, but they made sure Kendra had everything she needed to chase her dreams, sacrificing their comfort to buy her books and fuel her ambitions. "You don't have to stay here, Kendra. You can be more," her mother would always say during late-night conversations in their small kitchen, her voice filled with fierce determination. Her father, even when tired from long hours, would tell her to aim for the stars, his weathered hands gesturing toward a future he desperately wanted for his daughter. Kendra listened to every word and worked very hard to escape her difficult situation, studying late into the night while her parents slept, never losing sight of her ultimate goal. After she finished her degree in business management with honors, she quickly became a top event planner in Chicago, organizing corporate gatherings that impressed clients and built her reputation. But that was just the start. Her dreams were bigger than anything Chicago could offer, reaching beyond the familiar skyline to encompass the entire world. She wanted to work internationally, to prove that a girl from Detroit could compete with anyone from anywhere. So, when she got a chance to be a freelance event planner in Dubai for 6 months, she took it right away without hesitation. Dubai seemed to have everything she had dreamed of, the great wealth that flowed like golden rivers, the beautiful buildings that defied gravity, and the chance to meet the world's most important people. It was a city for new beginnings, where reinvention was not just possible but expected. She wasn't planning on staying forever. She was just a tourist, a foreigner with a lot to prove and everything to gain. At first, life in Dubai was just as she had imagined, perhaps even better. The luxury was overwhelming: marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, crystal chandeliers casting rainbow patterns on silk-covered walls. The culture was rich and complex, a fascinating blend of ancient traditions and cutting-edge modernity. The opportunities seemed endless, with every conversation leading to new possibilities and every event opening doors she hadn't known existed. But it wasn't just the tall buildings or the famous shopping malls that caught her attention. It was the people who moved through this world with confidence, speaking multiple languages and conducting million-dollar deals as casually as ordering coffee. And then, one evening at a high-profile charity gala, she met him, Sheikh Zayyan al-Bari. His name alone was enough to make everyone in a crowd quiet down. At 70, he was one of the richest and most powerful men in Dubai, a symbol of power and success. When Kendra first met him at the event she had planned meticulously, she felt his strong presence immediately. He wasn't loud or rude. He didn't need to be. He moved through the crowd with a quiet grace that made everyone pay attention, drawn by invisible magnetism that commanded respect without demanding it. Kendra was busy working at the event, making sure everything was running smoothly according to her detailed timeline, coordinating with vendors and ensuring every guest felt important. She never expected to meet someone like Zayyan personally, but as the evening progressed, he walked directly to her with purposeful steps. "You've done excellent work tonight," he said, his deep voice smooth and confident. "Not many people understand the details the way you do." Kendra was surprised but tried to stay calm. "Thank you, Sheikh Zayyan. It's an honor to be a part of this event." He smiled, his look holding both warmth and something unreadable. "I think you have potential. Maybe you would like to work with me on some of my upcoming projects? There are opportunities in Dubai that could change everything for someone like you." Her heart raced. To be invited into his world was beyond her wildest dreams. "I'd be honored, Sheikh Zayyan," she replied, her voice steady despite her excitement. From that moment, Zayyan began to pull her deeper into his world. His invitations to private dinners, exclusive events, and one-on-one meetings became frequent. Kendra quickly got used to a life she had only dreamed of. These weren't just clients. These were people who controlled the city and shaped its future. And now she was part of that world. She admired Zayyan, his intelligence, his charm, and his ability to handle the complex world of Dubai's elite. He spoke of his big plans for the future and Dubai's role on the world stage. Kendra, who was always hopeful, was swept up in his vision. He made her feel like she could be part of something much bigger than herself, a legacy that could change the world. She quickly found herself working on important projects with him. What started as casual meetings turned into late-night talks about business, strategy, and life. Zayyan's mentorship seemed to promise everything she had ever wanted: respect, success, and belonging. But as her admiration grew, she realized she was getting involved in something more complicated. The 6 months she had planned were running out, and the line between professional and personal life started to blur. Zayyan, despite his age, was magnetic in a way she hadn't expected. He commanded attention naturally. It wasn't just work opportunities that pulled Kendra in. It was the attention he gave her, the subtle ways he made her feel important. He seemed to see something in her that others didn't, something worth nurturing. As they spent more time together, Kendra started to feel dependent on his approval. She was caught up in his world, not realizing that with every gesture and word of praise, he was pulling her closer. Their conversations became increasingly intimate, covering everything from business philosophy to personal dreams. He would listen intently to her thoughts about her childhood in Detroit, her parents' sacrifices, and her ambitions for the future. These moments felt genuine, as if he truly understood her struggles and aspirations. She began to see him not just as a powerful businessman, but as someone who genuinely cared about her growth and success. The projects they worked on together became more significant and high-profile. She found herself attending meetings with government officials, international investors, and cultural leaders who shaped regional policy. Her input was valued, her ideas implemented, and her confidence grew with each successful event. She was no longer the outsider from Detroit. She was becoming an integral part of Dubai's elite social fabric. But with each passing week, the boundaries of their relationship became less clear. What had begun as professional mentorship evolved into something that felt personal and intimate. He would call her late at night to discuss not just business matters, but life, philosophy, and their shared vision for the future. These conversations lasted hours, creating a connection that felt deeper than anything she had experienced before. She had come to Dubai with a dream. She came as an outsider with hopes of building a career. But she never expected to find herself in the grip of someone so powerful. She never expected to be charmed not just by his world, but by his promises of a future she could never have imagined. Kendra started to fall under Zayyan's spell, charmed by his experience and the tempting promises of a future that seemed too good to be true. She believed in him and his vision for the future. The longer she spent with him, the more she believed this was where she was meant to be, that this was the life she was meant to have. Her temporary assignment had become something permanent in her mind, though she hadn't consciously made that decision. But her hope made her blind to the dangers. She didn't see that Zayyan's attention was a way to control her and make her feel indebted. She didn't realize that the more she fell for him, the more she lost her own identity. Her 6 months as a tourist had turned into a life she couldn't escape, a life tied to the man whose world she had once admired from far away. Zayyan had everything: wealth, power, and influence, but he lacked one thing Kendra had: her innocence. As she fell deeper into his world, she began to sense something wasn't quite right, though she couldn't yet see the full picture. She had come to Dubai with a dream. She never expected to be charmed by the one man who could destroy everything she believed in. From the moment Kendra Hart stepped into Zayyan al-Bari's world, she was swept away by a whirlwind of romance and luxury that consumed her every thought and desire. The intensity of her feelings surprised even herself. She had never been the type to lose herself completely in a relationship, but with Zayyan, all her carefully built defenses crumbled like sand castles before an incoming tide. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the cracks in the perfect picture started to show, revealing a man much more complex and calculating than she had ever imagined, yet somehow making her want him even more desperately. At first, their secret relationship was everything she had dreamed of and more. It was a private romance filled with passion and excitement, with dinners in fancy penthouses overlooking the glittering Dubai skyline, spontaneous trips to his private desert retreat where they could escape the world entirely, and weekends in exclusive villas that felt like something out of a fairy tale. Kendra had never felt so alive, so desired, so completely captivated by another human being. Every moment with Zayyan felt electric, charged with an intensity that made her previous relationships seem pale and insignificant by comparison. Zayyan was everything she had hoped for and more, a man of immense power and influence who could command attention with a single glance, yet who focused all that magnetic energy on her when they were alone together. He charmed her completely with his sophisticated conversation, his deep understanding of the world, and his ability to make her feel like the most fascinating woman he had ever encountered. He made her feel seen and important in ways she had never experienced before, and she felt pulled to him like a moth to a flame, unable to resist his gravitational pull even when she sensed danger in the heat. Her obsession with him grew stronger each day, becoming an all-consuming force that dominated her thoughts from the moment she woke up until she fell asleep thinking about their next meeting. She found herself checking her phone constantly for his messages, analyzing every word he spoke for hidden meanings, and planning her entire schedule around the possibility that he might call or want to see her. When he was away on business, she would count the hours until his return, feeling physically uncomfortable and restless without his presence in her life. But a subtle, worrying feeling started to grow inside her, like a small crack in a beautiful piece of glass that threatened to spread and shatter everything. Zayyan's love, while powerful and intoxicating, felt calculated and strategic at times, as if he had studied the art of seduction and was applying it with masterful precision. He was undeniably charming, and he made her feel like the most important woman in the world when he chose to focus his attention on her. But the deeper their relationship became, the more she noticed a darkness lurking beneath the surface, a kind of psychological control that was so subtle and sophisticated that she couldn't entirely escape it, even when she recognized it for what it was. Despite his grand promises of a shared future filled with love and adventure, he never fully committed to anything concrete or definitive. He was always careful with his words, always maintaining a certain emotional distance even in their most intimate moments, as if he was keeping her just close enough to feel real and meaningful, but not close enough to see the complete, unvarnished truth about his life and motivations. The late-night phone calls that would end abruptly when someone else entered his office, the way his voice would change to professional formality when others were around, his sudden disappearances for days at a time with vague explanations about business obligations. All these small details started to paint a picture of a man with a carefully hidden agenda that she was only beginning to understand. For Zayyan's part, the relationship represented something he had never expected to find at this stage of his life: genuine connection with someone who saw beyond his wealth and status to the man underneath. Unlike his previous affairs, which had been primarily physical escapes from his empty marriage, Kendra stirred something deeper in him, something that felt dangerously close to the love he had once shared with Nawal in their early years together. He found himself genuinely caring about her thoughts and dreams, enjoying their long conversations about everything from her childhood in Detroit to their shared visions for the future. But this genuine feeling only made the situation more complicated and frightening for him. His reputation, built over decades of careful cultivation, was everything in Dubai's conservative social circles. One scandal could unravel not just his marriage, but his business relationships, his standing in the community, and the legacy he planned to leave his children. The more he cared about Kendra, the more dangerous she became to everything he had spent his life building. Yet he found himself unable to let her go. Zayyan's devotion seemed absolutely real and sincere when they were alone together, when they could forget about the outside world and exist in their private bubble of intimacy and connection. During these moments, he would speak to her with a vulnerability that she sensed he rarely showed anyone, sharing his fears about aging, his regrets about choices he had made, and his dreams for what remained of his life. But the moment they were in public, even at events where she was working professionally, it was as if she didn't exist to him at all. He would be polite but distant, his eyes turning cold and formal, maintaining a professional distance that Kendra couldn't understand and that hurt her more than she wanted to admit. The first time she really felt the full weight of his manipulation was during a quiet weekend trip to his private desert home, a sprawling compound hidden away from the city's prying eyes. He had promised it would be a time for just the two of them to be completely honest and open with each other, to explore the depth of their connection without any outside interference. But when they arrived at the isolated location, the magnificent house began to feel less like a romantic retreat and more like a beautiful prison, cut off from everything and everyone she knew, leaving her completely dependent on him for company, transportation, and contact with the outside world. The first night they spent together there was magical and intense, filled with passion and intimate conversation that made her feel like she was experiencing love for the first time in her life. For several hours, Kendra was convinced that this was everything she had ever wanted, that she had found her soulmate against all odds. But when morning came, harsh reality began to seep in like sunlight through curtains. Zayyan left her alone for hours without explanation, and when he finally returned from whatever mysterious business had called him away, his entire mood and demeanor had changed completely. He was colder, more distant, and seemed to be evaluating her reactions with the detached calculation of a scientist studying a laboratory specimen. That evening, as they shared a quiet dinner by the illuminated pool under a canopy of desert stars, Kendra couldn't contain her growing anxiety and confusion any longer. The silence between them had become oppressive, filled with unspoken questions and doubts that were eating away at her peace of mind. Zayyan, is this relationship real? Or is this just a temporary thing that you're enjoying while it's convenient? Her voice trembled with a mixture of desperate hope and growing uncertainty, her heart pounding as she waited for his response. He looked at her across the table, his dark eyes unreadable in the flickering candlelight, and for a moment she saw something that might have been genuine conflict or pain. Of course it's real, Kendra. I want you more than I've wanted anything in years. I always have. He reached across the elegant table setting and took her hand in his touch sending familiar electricity through her body. But you must understand, this life I live, it's incredibly complicated. There are things I can't easily explain, people and obligations I have to consider. My life is not entirely mine to control, no matter how much I might wish it were. For a moment, Kendra allowed herself to believe him completely, to accept his explanation and push away her growing doubts. After all, he was Sheikh Zayyan al-Bari, one of the most powerful businessmen in the Middle East, a man who navigated complex international relationships and managed vast business enterprises. Of course his life would be complicated in ways she couldn't fully understand. But even as she tried to convince herself, She felt the weight of his carefully chosen words, the things he wasn't saying, the truths he was skillfully avoiding, the way he managed to sound sincere while revealing almost nothing concrete about their future together. That night, as they lay together in his enormous bed, she felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and unease that she couldn't quite name or shake. She couldn't deny how intoxicated she was by his world, by the luxury and excitement, and the feeling of being chosen by someone so powerful and sophisticated. But the more time she spent with him, the more clearly she could sense that he was always thinking several steps ahead, always calculating the risks and benefits of every word and action. He was hiding something significant from her, and she had no idea how far he would go to protect his secrets or what he might sacrifice to maintain his carefully constructed life. As the weeks passed, their affair continued with all the passion and intensity it had possessed from the beginning, but an underlying tension grew stronger every day, like a fault line building pressure beneath the surface. Kendra had moved into one of his secret apartments on the outskirts of Dubai, a stylish, modern space that felt like it had been designed specifically for discreet rendezvous. At first, having their own private sanctuary felt exciting and romantic, like they were creating their own world away from the judgment and interference of others. But as the days turned into weeks, the isolation of their secret life started to feel suffocating and unnatural. The apartment was beautiful but sterile, lacking any personal touches or sense of permanence that might suggest a real future together. Zayyan would come and go according to his own mysterious schedule, often leaving her alone for days at a time with nothing but vague promises about when he might return. During these lonely periods, she would sit by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the sprawling city below, wondering what had happened to the independent, ambitious woman she had once been. Her obsession with him had become so complete that she found it almost impossible to imagine life without him, even as she recognized how unhealthy her dependence had become. She had given up her own apartment, turned down other work opportunities, and isolated herself from the few friends she had made in Dubai, all to be available whenever he wanted her. Was this really what she had come to Dubai to find? To become a hidden part of a world built on secrecy and deception? Or had she simply allowed herself to be so thoroughly manipulated by his charm and promises that she had lost sight of her own goals and values? And yet, despite her growing awareness of the problematic dynamics in their relationship, she found herself completely unable to break free from his influence. Zayyan had developed such a powerful hold over her emotions and self-worth that the thought of leaving him felt like contemplating her own destruction. Every time she considered walking away and reclaiming her independence, she would remember the way he looked at her during their most intimate moments, the promises he made about their future together, the way he could make her feel more desired and valuable than anyone ever had before. But these moments of doubt and clarity were always temporary, swept away by his next romantic gesture or passionate declaration. He had become a drug she couldn't quit, an addiction that was slowly consuming her ability to think rationally about her own best interests. She knew, intellectually, that their relationship was built on an unstable foundation of secrecy and lies, but emotionally she remained completely devoted to him, willing to accept whatever terms he offered, rather than face the emptiness of life without him. As their affair continued in its pattern of intense connection followed by painful separation, Kendra started to question her actual place in his complicated life more seriously. He would never introduce her to his family, never brought her to social events where his wife might be present, and never talked in any detail about Nawal except to dismiss their marriage as a cold arrangement that meant nothing to him emotionally. He would promise Kendra that his marriage was purely for appearances and social convenience, that he had truly fallen in love with her in a way he hadn't experienced in decades. But despite these reassurances, Kendra couldn't shake the growing feeling that something fundamental was being hidden from her. She began to suspect that she was not the only woman in his life, that she was just the most recent in a long line of young women he had kept hidden from his business partners, his family, and Dubai's conservative social establishment. The thought was painful but persistent, supported by small details she had noticed. Phone calls he would take in private, unexplained absences, the way certain staff members at his properties seemed familiar with arrangements for discreet visitors. One evening, after he had returned from a particularly long business trip to London, Kendra decided she could no longer avoid confronting the questions that were eating away at her peace of mind. Why can't we ever be seen together publicly, Zayyan? Why does our relationship always have to exist in complete secrecy? Her voice was shakier than she would have liked, but she was determined to get some honest answers. He paused in the middle of pouring wine, his face becoming unreadable in the way she had learned to recognize as a defensive mechanism. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of weariness that seemed genuine. "It's more complicated than you can understand, Kendra. You have to trust me on this. This is simply how things work in my world, in my culture, given my position and responsibilities. We can't change the reality of my situation overnight. Not yet. But soon, I promise you, soon we'll find a way to be together more openly." But even as he spoke the words, Kendra could hear the hollowness in his promise, the same vague reassurance he had been giving her for months without any concrete steps toward making it reality. She was beginning to realize that she had everything Zayyan had initially promised her: luxury, excitement, adventure, and passionate romance. But the emotional and psychological price of his love was becoming unbearably high. She was starting to understand that she had become just another carefully managed component of his complex life, a pawn in his sophisticated game of maintaining control over every aspect of his existence while avoiding any real risk to his reputation or established relationships. She had gained access to a world of unimaginable wealth and privilege, but she was slowly losing herself in the process, becoming someone she barely recognized, obsessed, dependent, and increasingly isolated from any life or identity outside of her connection to him. The weeks following their desert conversation had been a careful dance of promises and postponements. Kendra found herself caught in an exhausting cycle of hope and disappointment, each day bringing new assurances from Zayyan about their future, followed by more delays and complications that seemed to multiply endlessly. Her obsession with him had reached a dangerous peak where she could barely function when he wasn't around, checking her phone obsessively for his messages and feeling physically ill during his unexplained absences. Zayyan, meanwhile, was struggling with his own internal conflict. His feelings for Kendra had grown deeper than he had ever intended, creating a genuine emotional attachment that terrified him. Unlike his previous affairs, which had been purely physical escapes, Kendra represented something he thought he had lost forever: the possibility of real connection and understanding. But this very connection made her more dangerous to his carefully constructed life than any woman had ever been. The breaking point came when Kendra's behavior became increasingly erratic and demanding. She had begun questioning him more aggressively about their future, asking pointed questions about when he would leave Nawal, when they could be seen together publicly, when she could meet his children. Her growing desperation was starting to attract attention from his staff and business associates, creating exactly the kind of scrutiny he had spent his entire life avoiding. "I can't continue living like this, Zayyan," she had said during their last meeting at the secret apartment, her voice shaking with emotion. "I need to know where this is going. I need something real and concrete, not just promises that never materialize." Her eyes were red from crying, and he could see the toll their relationship was taking on her mental health. It was then that Zayyan made a calculated decision that he convinced himself was motivated by love rather than damage control. "You're right, Habibti," he had said, taking her hands in his with what appeared to be genuine tenderness. "We do need to talk seriously about our future, away from all the distractions and pressures here in Dubai. Let me take you to London for a few days. We can have complete privacy there, and I can explain everything properly." The idea of escaping Dubai together felt like a dream come true to Kendra. Finally, she thought, he was ready to prioritize their relationship over his complicated obligations. "We need to get away from everything," he had continued, his voice taking on the romantic tone that always made her heart race. "London will give us the space to think clearly about what we want, about how we can build a real life together." Kendra had been cautiously optimistic, desperately hoping that this trip would finally bring the clarity and commitment she had been craving for months. She had packed carefully, choosing outfits that would be appropriate for the sophisticated restaurants and cultural events she imagined them attending together. For the first time in weeks, she felt genuinely hopeful about their future. But Zayyan's true motivation was more complex and self-serving than Kendra could have imagined. He had been receiving increasingly urgent pressure from his family and business partners about his recent behavior. Nawal, while she maintained her public composure, had been asking subtle but pointed questions about his frequent absences and late-night phone calls. His son Faris had mentioned seeing him at restaurants with a young woman on multiple occasions, and while he hadn't pursued the matter directly, the implication was clear that people were starting to notice and talk. Most pressingly, Zayyan's upcoming 40th wedding anniversary celebration was just 2 weeks away, a lavish event that had been planned for months and would host some of the most powerful people in the Middle East. The guest list included government ministers, international business leaders, and members of royal families from across the region. Any scandal or disruption to this event would be catastrophic for his reputation and business relationships. Zayyan had decided that the London trip would serve multiple purposes. It would remove Kendra from Dubai during the most sensitive period of anniversary preparations, give him an opportunity to gradually distance himself from their relationship in a controlled environment, and allow him to manage the situation without creating the kind of dramatic scene that could lead to public exposure. Now, as their private jet climbed steadily into the darkening sky above Dubai, the city's golden lights becoming smaller and smaller below, Kendra sat in one of the plush cream leather seats, her fingers gripping the armrests tightly. The cabin was extraordinarily luxurious, with polished mahogany tables, gold fixtures, and soft lighting that created an atmosphere of wealth and privilege. But despite the opulent surroundings, she felt a growing sense of unease that she couldn't quite identify. Zayyan had been unusually quiet since they boarded, spending most of his time absorbed in his tablet and making phone calls in Arabic that he conducted in hushed tones. When she tried to engage him in conversation about their London plans, he gave vague, distracted responses that lacked his usual charm and attention. Something felt different about his demeanor, but she told herself it was probably just the stress of leaving his business responsibilities for several days. About 2 hours into the flight, as they crossed over Iranian airspace, Zayyan's phone rang with a call that would shatter her world completely. He glanced at the caller ID and answered immediately, speaking in rapid Arabic while moving toward the back of the cabin for privacy. But the jet's acoustics carried his voice clearly, and Kendra's months of exposure to Arabic conversations had given her enough understanding to catch keywords and phrases. What she heard made her blood turn cold. Zayyan was speaking to his personal assistant, Mahmoud, about arrangements for his anniversary celebration with Nawal. The conversation was detailed and enthusiastic, covering everything from the flower arrangements and menu selections to the guest seating arrangements and entertainment schedule. She heard him discussing the anniversary gift he had commissioned, a custom-designed diamond necklace that had cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. "Make sure the roses are the same shade as her wedding dress," she heard him say with obvious care and attention. "And confirm that the orchestra knows her favorite pieces. This needs to be perfect, Mahmoud. 40 years deserves nothing less than perfection." The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Zayyan discussing every detail of what was clearly planned to be the social event of the season. He spoke about Nawal with a tenderness and consideration that Kendra had never heard him use when discussing his wife before. This wasn't the voice of a man trapped in a loveless marriage of convenience. This was someone planning a celebration of genuine significance. As the call ended and Zayyan returned to his seat, Kendra felt as if the cabin floor had disappeared beneath her feet. Everything he had told her about his marriage being empty and meaningless had been a lie. The anniversary celebration he was planning was elaborate and heartfelt, the kind of event that spoke to real commitment and affection. She realized with crushing clarity that while she had been living in their secret apartment, believing herself to be the center of his emotional world, he had been planning this grand romantic gesture for his wife. "That was business," Zayyan said casually as he settled back into his seat, not meeting her eyes. Some last-minute details that needed attention. But Kendra had heard enough to understand the truth. She wasn't the love of his life. She was exactly what he had claimed she wasn't. A temporary distraction, a side entertainment while he maintained his real life with Nawal. The London trip wasn't about planning their future together. It was about managing her reaction to being discarded. The confrontation that followed was brutal and final. When Zayyan coldly dismissed her as nothing more than a temporary pleasure and a passing fancy, something fundamental broke inside Kendra. The rage that had been building for months finally erupted. "You think you can just discard me?" Kendra's voice was low and dangerous, filled with a fury that surprised even her. "You think you can manipulate me for months, make me completely dependent on you, and then throw me away when I become inconvenient?" Zayyan looked at her with mild interest, as if watching a mildly entertaining performance. "You were always going to be discarded eventually," he said with chilling matter-of-factness. The only question was timing. His words were the final straw. In a blur of rage and desperation, Kendra stood up, her body shaking with an intensity that felt volcanic. She walked toward the jet's small galley, where where she spotted a sharp knife lying on the counter, probably left there by the catering staff who had prepared their in-flight meal. Without conscious thought, she grabbed the knife, her hands trembling not with fear but with a rage that demanded action. When she turned back toward Zayyan, he was still sitting calmly, scrolling through his tablet as if their conversation had been nothing more than a minor interruption to his important work. The sight of his casual indifference, even now, after destroying her entire world, filled her with a fury that obliterated all rational thought. She moved toward him, the knife clutched in her shaking hands, her vision clouded by months of accumulated pain and betrayal. "Kendra, what are you?" Zayyan began, finally looking up from his tablet with the first expression of genuine surprise she had seen from him all evening. But she was beyond hearing anything he might say. In one swift, desperate motion, she plunged the knife into his chest, just below his heart. His eyes widened in shock and disbelief, his mouth opening in a silent gasp as blood began to spread across his expensive white shirt. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Zayyan looked down at the knife protruding from his chest, then back at Kendra's face, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. Blood began to pool around him, staining the pristine leather of his seat, and his breathing became labored and shallow. "You promised me everything?" Kendra whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the engines. "And you gave me nothing but lies." Zayyan tried to speak, but only blood came from his mouth. Within minutes, his body went still, his eyes staring sightlessly at the cabin ceiling. The reality of what she had done hit Kendra like a physical blow. She stood frozen for several moments, staring at Zayyan's lifeless body, her hands still covered in his blood. Then panic set in. She had to act quickly. The flight crew would eventually check on them, and she needed to buy time to think. With shaking hands, she pressed the call button for the flight attendant. When the woman appeared at the cabin entrance, Kendra forced herself to speak with as much composure as she could manage. "I need help," she said, her voice trembling with what appeared to be panic and confusion. "Sheikh Zayyan, he just collapsed. I think he's having a heart attack. He was complaining of chest pains and then he just... Please, we need to get him to a hospital immediately." The flight attendant rushed forward, taking one look at Zayyan's condition before immediately calling for the captain. Within minutes, the cockpit crew had been alerted to the medical emergency. "We're declaring a medical emergency and diverting to the nearest suitable airport," the captain announced over the intercom. "Please remain seated and calm while we coordinate with air traffic control." The jet banked sharply as the pilots changed course, heading for Athens International Airport, which was the closest major airport capable of handling their aircraft and providing immediate medical assistance. The flight attendant did her best to assess Zayyan's condition, but it was clear that he was beyond help. As the plane descended toward Athens, Kendra sat in stunned silence, the full weight of her actions finally settling over her. She had killed him, the man who had controlled every aspect of their relationship, who had held all the cards and made all the rules, was dead by her hand. When they touched down at Athens International Airport, emergency medical teams were already waiting on the tarmac. Paramedics rushed aboard the aircraft, but it took them only moments to determine that Sheikh Zayyan al-Bari had not died of natural causes. The knife wound, despite Kendra's attempts to position his body to hide it, was unmistakably deliberate. Greek authorities immediately secured the aircraft as a crime scene, and Kendra was detained for questioning. The elaborate web of lies that Zayyan had spent years constructing was about to unravel, and the truth about his manipulation and her desperate act of revenge would soon be exposed to the world. Kendra felt a complex mixture of relief and terror. She had refused to be discarded quietly, but the price of her revenge would be everything she had left. The emergency vehicles surrounded the private jet on the tarmac at Athens International Airport, their flashing lights cutting through the gray afternoon sky. What had begun as a routine medical emergency diversion was rapidly transforming into something far more sinister. Kendra sat in the luxurious cabin, her hands still trembling, watching through the window as Greek paramedics and airport security personnel approached the aircraft. She had called for help immediately after stabbing Zayyan, claiming he had suffered a heart attack. For the past hour, as the pilots diverted to Athens and coordinated with emergency services, she had sat beside his lifeless body, the reality of what she had done slowly sinking in. The man who had promised her everything lay dead just feet away, a victim of her rage and shattered trust. When the paramedics boarded the aircraft, they found exactly what the flight crew had reported. a murder scene with the perpetrator already in custody. Kendra sat restrained in her seat, still covered in blood, while Zayyan's body remained where he had died. There was no doubt about what had occurred. Detective Inspector Nikos Papadopoulos of the Hellenic Police took charge of the scene. While the basic facts were clear, Kendra had confessed to stabbing Zayyan. The international nature of the case and the prominence of the victim meant this would require careful investigation and coordination with multiple jurisdictions. Ms. Hart, Detective Papadopoulos said as Kendra was formally arrested and taken into custody, "You have confessed to killing Sheikh al-Bari. We will need to understand exactly what happened and why." The confession opened the floodgates to a much larger and more complex investigation. While Greek authorities had jurisdiction over the immediate crime, the international nature of the case required coordination with Dubai police, where both the victim and perpetrator were residents, and potentially with British authorities, since London had been their intended destination. Detective Papadopoulos contacted Detective Inspector Rashid Al-Mansouri of the Dubai police, who had been investigating Sheikh Zayyan's business activities for some time. The two law enforcement agencies quickly established a joint investigation protocol, with Greece handling the immediate murder case while Dubai investigated the background and motive. "We've been aware of Sheikh al-Bari's complicated personal life for years," Detective Al-Mansouri explained during a secure video conference with his Greek counterpart. "There have been whispers about his relationships with younger women, but his wealth and influence protected him from serious scrutiny. This case might finally expose the full extent of his activities." The aircraft was treated as a crime scene by Greek forensic specialists, who photographed every inch of the cabin and collected blood samples, fingerprints, and other physical evidence. The murder weapon, a knife from the jet's galley, was carefully bagged and tagged. The lack of signs of struggle suggested the attack had been swift and unexpected, but investigators needed to understand the complex web of relationships and motivations that had led to this moment. Meanwhile, news of Sheikh Zayyan al-Bari's death began to spread through Dubai's elite circles. The official story released to the media spoke only of a medical emergency during flight and his subsequent death in Athens, but rumors of foul play quickly began to circulate among those who knew about his extramarital activities. In Dubai, Detective Al-Mansouri began the painstaking process of investigating Zayyan's background and his relationship with Kendra. Working with Greek authorities who were conducting parallel interviews with Kendra in Athens, he started to piece together the story of manipulation and obsession that had led to murder. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the immediate crime. Detective Al-Mansouri had long suspected that Zayyan's public image as a devoted family man masked a more complicated reality. Financial records, obtained through international cooperation agreements, revealed significant expenditures on apartments, jewelry, and travel expenses for various women over the years, including Kendra. Digital forensic specialists in both Greece and Dubai worked together to analyze Zayyan's electronic devices. His phone, tablet, and computer systems contained a treasure trove of communications that revealed the true extent of his deception. Encrypted messaging apps showed conversations with at least 6 different women over the past 5 years, each believing herself to be the only one receiving his attention and promises of a future together. The pattern that emerged was remarkably consistent across all these relationships. Zayyan would identify young, ambitious women, often those working in his business sphere or seeking advancement in Dubai's competitive professional environment. He would begin with professional mentorship, gradually building trust and dependency, before escalating to romantic involvement. Each woman received the same promises about leaving his wife, the same explanations about the complexity of his situation, and the same eventual disappointment when those promises proved empty. As more evidence emerged, Detective Al-Mansouri began contacting these other women in Dubai, while Greek authorities continued their interrogation of Kendra in Athens. Sophia, the event planner who had preceded Kendra, broke down in tears when informed of Zayyan's death during a video call between Athens and Dubai. "He made me feel like I was the only woman who had ever mattered to him," Sophia told the international team of investigators through her tears. "He promised we would be together once his business situations were resolved. I waited for months, believing every excuse he gave me." Layla, another of Zayyan's former mistresses, provided perhaps the most damning testimony about his methods of manipulation. "He was a master at making you feel special while keeping you isolated," she explained during her interview in Dubai. "He would shower you with attention and gifts, make you feel like you were part of some grand romance, but he always maintained complete control over when and how you could contact him. The investigation into Zayyan's family life revealed equally disturbing truths. While Nawal had maintained her public composure for years, interviews with household staff and close family friends revealed that she had been well aware of her husband's infidelities. However, she had chosen to maintain the facade of their marriage rather than confront the painful reality of their relationship. Mrs. al-Bari knew about the other women, revealed Amira, who had worked as the family's personal assistant for over a decade. She would sometimes find receipts for jewelry she had never received, or notice charges for restaurants she had never visited. But she never said anything directly. She seemed to believe that as long as it remained private, it wouldn't destroy their family. Nawal's initial reaction to news of her husband's death had been genuine grief and shock. Despite everything, she had lost her life partner and the father of her children. But as the investigation revealed the full extent of his deceptions, her mourning became complicated by anger and a grim sense of vindication. "I gave him 40 years of my life," she told Detective Al-Mansouri during her interview, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "I knew he wasn't faithful, but I believed he would eventually grow tired of these distractions and remember what really mattered. I never imagined it would end like this." Faris and Zaina, Zayyan's adult children, struggled to reconcile the father they had known with the man revealed by the investigation. Faris, who had been groomed to take over the family business empire, now faced the additional burden of managing the scandal surrounding his father's death. "I knew he was demanding and controlling in business," Faris admitted to investigators, "but I never realized he applied those same tactics to his personal relationships. The man who taught me about integrity and responsibility was living a completely different life in private." Meanwhile, in Athens, Kendra was being held in detention while Greek and Dubai authorities worked out the complex legal jurisdictions involved in her case. The international nature of the crime, committed on a UAE-registered aircraft in international airspace but discovered on Greek soil, created unprecedented legal challenges. Detective Papadopoulos continued his interviews with Kendra, gradually extracting the full story of her relationship with Zayyan and the events that had led to his murder. Her account was consistent with the pattern of manipulation that Dubai investigators were discovering through their interviews with his other victims. "The first time I really questioned everything was when I overheard him on the phone," Kendra explained during one of her sessions with the Greek detective. "We were supposedly flying to London to discuss our future together, but instead I heard him making detailed arrangements for his anniversary celebration with his wife, 40 years of marriage, and he was planning this elaborate, romantic event while sitting just feet away from me." As the investigation continued, the deeper truths about Zayyan's character and methods became increasingly clear. He had used his wealth, charm, and position not just to attract women, but to systematically control and manipulate them. Each relationship followed a carefully orchestrated pattern designed to create maximum emotional dependency while maintaining his own freedom and protecting his public image. For Kendra, sitting in her detention cell in Athens awaiting extradition proceedings, the emotional weight of these revelations was almost unbearable. She had believed herself to be special, chosen, loved in a way that transcended ordinary relationships. Instead, she had discovered that she was simply the latest victim in a decades-long pattern of emotional manipulation and abuse. The evidence collected by the international team of investigators painted a picture of a man who had perfected the art of psychological control. Zayyan had kept detailed records of his relationships, almost like a scientist studying subjects in an experiment. Notes in his private files revealed his calculated approach to managing multiple women simultaneously, including strategies for avoiding discovery and maintaining their emotional dependency. As the full scope of Zayyan's deception became public knowledge, Dubai's elite social circles were rocked by scandal. The man who had been held up as a pillar of the community, a successful businessman and devoted family man, was revealed to have been living an elaborate double life built on systematic manipulation and emotional abuse. The investigation had unwound the carefully constructed web of lies that Zayyan had built around himself, exposing not just his individual crimes but a broader pattern of how power and privilege could be used to exploit vulnerable people. His business empire, built on his reputation for integrity and reliability, now faced scrutiny and potential collapse as partners and investors distanced themselves from the scandal. After weeks of legal negotiations between Greek and UAE authorities, it was determined that Kendra would be extradited to Dubai to face trial. since that was where both she and Zayyan were residents and where their relationship had developed. The Greek government would cooperate fully with the Dubai prosecution, providing all evidence and testimony needed for the case. For the women who had been caught in Zayyan's web of manipulation, his death brought a complex mixture of closure and continued trauma. While they were finally free from his control, they also had to confront the reality of how thoroughly they had been deceived and used. And for Kendra, the woman who had delivered the final, fatal blow, the investigation's findings offered little comfort. Understanding the full extent of Zayyan's manipulation helped explain how she had been driven to such desperate action, but it could not undo the fact that she had taken a human life. As she awaited extradition to Dubai to face trial for murder, she was left to grapple with the consequences of a single moment of rage that had forever changed not just her life, but the lives of everyone connected to Sheikh Zayyan al-Bari. The Athens chapter of this international scandal was closing, but the real reckoning was yet to come. The extradition process took 3 months to complete, during which Kendra remained in detention at a secure facility in Athens while lawyers from 2 countries negotiated the complex legal framework for her transfer. On a gray November morning, she was escorted aboard a commercial flight to Dubai, flanked by 2 Greek police officers. As the plane lifted off from Athens International Airport, she watched the Mediterranean coast disappear below, knowing she might never see it again. Detective Inspector Rashid Al-Mansouri was waiting on the tarmac when the aircraft touched down at Dubai International Airport. The media attention was intense, with news helicopters circling overhead and crowds of protesters and supporters gathering along the route to Allure Central Jail, where Kendra would be held pending trial. Her first visitor was Sarah Mitchell, the American attorney who had agreed to represent her case. Mitchell specialized in defending women who had been victims of domestic abuse and psychological manipulation, recognizing the patterns of coercive control that had characterized Kendra's relationship with Zayyan. The prosecution is seeking first-degree murder, Mitchell explained during their initial meeting. But I believe we can demonstrate that you were the victim of sustained psychological abuse that drove you to temporary insanity. 6 months after her return to Dubai, the trial of Kendra Hart began in the Dubai Court of First Instance. The courthouse was packed with international media, legal observers, women's rights activists, and members of both families. Judge Hassan al-Rashid, known for his careful handling of complex cases, presided over what had become one of the most closely watched trials in UAE legal history. The prosecution, led by Chief Prosecutor Ahmed Al-Zara, presented their opening statement with stark clarity. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about cold-blooded murder. The defendant, Kendra Hart, came to our country as a guest and repaid our hospitality by brutally killing one of our most respected citizens. Sheikh Zayyan al-Bari was a pillar of our community, a successful businessman, and a devoted father. Yes, he made mistakes in his personal life, but those mistakes did not deserve a death sentence. Al-Zara methodically presented evidence showing that Kendra had multiple opportunities to leave the relationship and seek help. Phone records, travel documents, and financial statements demonstrated that she was never held against her will and had the means to return to America at any time. The defendant chose violence over reason, Al-Zara continued. She boarded that aircraft with murder in her heart, and when Sheikh al-Bari finally told her the truth about their relationship, she killed him in cold blood. The defense team, led by Sarah Mitchell, presented a dramatically different narrative. My client came to Dubai with dreams and ambitions, Mitchell said in her opening statement. She was targeted by a man who had perfected the art of psychological manipulation over decades of practice. Sheikh al-Bari didn't just break her heart. He systematically destroyed her sense of reality, her self-worth, and her ability to make rational decisions. The prosecution called Nawal al-Bari as their first witness. Despite everything she had learned about her husband's affairs, she presented herself with dignity and spoke with genuine emotion about their 40-year marriage. He was not a perfect man, Nawal testified, her voice steady despite the obvious pain in her eyes. I knew about his relationships with other women, and I chose to forgive them because I believed in the fundamental goodness of the man I married. He was planning a beautiful anniversary celebration for us, proof that despite his mistakes, he was trying to rebuild our marriage. Miss Hart took that opportunity away from us forever. Under cross-examination, Mitchell gently but persistently questioned Nawal about her knowledge of her husband's systematic manipulation of women. Mrs. al-Bari, Were you aware that your husband had maintained similar relationships with at least 8 different women over 15 years? I knew he had affairs, Nawal replied quietly. But I didn't know the extent of his deception until after his death. Faris al-Bari testified next, his anger at his father's killer barely contained. My father was working to become better, he said. He had spoken to me about ending his affairs and focusing on his family. Miss Hart murdered him just as he was trying to change his life. The prosecution presented extensive evidence of the murder itself. Forensic reports, photographs from the crime scene, testimony from the flight crew, and Greek police officers who had taken Kendra's confession. The knife wound was described in clinical detail, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the attack. Sarah Mitchell's defense strategy centered on exposing the systematic nature of Zayyan's psychological manipulation. She called Dr. Jennifer Coleman, a renowned psychiatrist specializing in coercive control, as her first expert witness. Mr. al-Bari employed what we call trauma bonding, Dr. Coleman explained to the jury. He created a cycle of intense emotional highs followed by devastating lows, designed to make Miss Hart completely dependent on his approval and presence. This type of psychological manipulation can be more damaging than physical abuse because it attacks the victim's fundamental sense of reality. Dr. Coleman presented research showing how sustained psychological manipulation could lead to temporary breaks from reality, especially when the victim suddenly realizes the extent to which they have been deceived and controlled. The defense then called several of Zayyan's former victims to testify. Sophia, the event planner who had preceded Kendra, broke down on the witness stand as she described her own experience. He made me believe I was the only woman who had ever mattered to him, Sophia said through tears. He used the exact same words, the same promises, the same explanations about his complicated life. When I found out about the others, it felt like my entire world collapsed. If I had been in Miss Hart's position, confronted with his cruelty in such an enclosed space, I don't know what I might have done. Layla, another former victim, provided damaging testimony about Zayyan's methods. He was a master at making you feel special while keeping you isolated, she explained. He would shower you with attention and gifts, make you feel like you were part of some grand romance, but he always maintained complete control over when and how you could contact him. Mitchell presented financial records showing Zayyan's systematic expenditures on women over 15 years, digital communications revealing identical manipulation tactics across multiple relationships, and expert analysis of his psychological control methods. When Kendra finally testified in her own defense, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke clearly and honestly about her relationship with Zayyan, holding nothing back about her own obsession and emotional dependency. I don't expect anyone to excuse what I did, she said, looking directly at the jury. Taking a human life is wrong, no matter what drove me to that moment. But I want you to understand that for months, I wasn't living in reality. I was living in a carefully constructed fantasy that Sheikh al-Bari had created to control me. She described in detail the moment she had overheard Zayyan's phone conversation about his anniversary plans, and how that revelation had destroyed every belief she had held about their relationship. I realized that while I was isolating myself from friends and family, sacrificing my career goals, and planning my entire future around him, he was planning a romantic celebration with his wife, Kendra testified. Everything I had believed about our love was a lie. I felt like I was going insane, like I couldn't trust my own thoughts or feelings anymore. The cross-examination was brutal. Prosecutor Al-Zara challenged every aspect of Kendra's account, suggesting that her actions were motivated by selfish anger rather than psychological breakdown. Isn't it true, Miss Hart, that you killed Sheikh al-Bari because you couldn't accept that he had chosen his wife over you? Al-Zara demanded. No, Kendra replied firmly. I killed him because in that moment, I felt like he had destroyed my entire sense of self. It wasn't about jealousy. It was about the realization that everything I had believed about myself and my worth was based on lies he had told me. The defense presented additional expert witnesses, including Dr. Maria Stavros, the Greek forensic psychologist who had evaluated Kendra after her arrest. Dr. Stavros testified about Kendra's mental state at the time of the crime and the psychological factors that had contributed to her breakdown. Miss Hart exhibits classic symptoms of someone who has endured sustained psychological manipulation, Dr. Stavros explained. Her actions occurred during what appears to have been a complete psychological break, triggered by the sudden realization of the extent to which she had been deceived and used. The prosecution countered with their own expert, Dr. Ahmed Khalil, a Dubai-based psychiatrist who argued that psychological manipulation, while harmful, could never justify murder. Many people experience difficult relationships and emotional manipulation, Dr. Khalil testified. The vast majority do not resort to violence. The defendant made a conscious choice to kill, and that choice cannot be excused by her emotional state. In his closing argument, prosecutor Al-Zahra emphasized the finality and brutality of Kendra's actions. Sheikh al-Bari is dead, and no amount of explanation can change that fact. The defendant had choices. She could have left Dubai, ended the relationship, sought help from authorities or counseling services. Instead, she chose murder. He argued that accepting the defense's arguments would set a dangerous precedent, essentially giving victims of emotional manipulation license to kill their abusers. Sarah Mitchell's closing argument focused on the extraordinary circumstances that had driven Kendra to violence. "My client is not asking to be excused from responsibility," she told the jury. "She is asking for understanding of how a young woman with dreams and ambitions could be so systematically destroyed by a master manipulator that she lost all sense of reality and proportion." Mitchell emphasized the pattern of abuse that Zayyan had perpetrated against multiple women, arguing that Kendra's case represented the inevitable culmination of decades of psychological manipulation and control. After 3 weeks of testimony and 5 days of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. The foreman stood as Judge Al-Rashid asked for their decision. "We find the defendant guilty of manslaughter in the first degree." The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions. Some observers felt justice had been served, while others believed Kendra should have been acquitted entirely or convicted of murder. The al-Bari family looked relieved that she had been convicted, while Kendra's supporters felt the verdict acknowledged the extreme circumstances that had driven her to violence. 2 weeks later, Judge Al-Rashid delivered his sentencing remarks, acknowledging the complex circumstances that had led to the crime, while emphasizing that taking a life could never be justified. "Miss Hart, you were clearly the victim of sustained psychological manipulation by a man who exploited your vulnerability and trust," Judge Al-Rashid said. "However, the law cannot excuse the taking of human life, regardless of the provocation. You must face the consequences of your actions, while society also acknowledges the circumstances that drove you to this tragic moment." Kendra was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. The sentence was less severe than many had expected, reflecting the court's recognition of the mitigating circumstances in her case. As Kendra was led away in handcuffs, she felt a complex mixture of relief and regret. The truth had finally been told, justice had been served according to the law, but the cost had been devastating for everyone involved. The al-Bari family was left to rebuild their lives in the shadow of scandal and tragedy. Nawal faced the challenge of preserving her family's reputation while acknowledging the truth about her husband's behavior. Faris struggled to maintain the family business while distancing it from his father's personal failures. Many of their business partnerships dissolved, and the family's social standing in Dubai's elite circles was permanently damaged. For Kendra's family in Detroit, the trial's conclusion brought its own challenges. Her parents, Celestine and Donovan, who had sacrificed so much to give their daughter opportunities, now had to accept that those same opportunities had led to tragedy. They faced their own community's judgment and struggled with guilt about their daughter's fate. The case had broader implications for Dubai's legal system and society. It sparked conversations about domestic abuse, psychological manipulation, and the vulnerability of foreign workers to exploitation by powerful locals. Women's rights organizations used Kendra's case as an example of how victims of abuse could be driven to extreme measures when they felt they had no other options. Several of Zayyan's other victims came forward after the trial, sharing their stories publicly for the first time. Their testimonies led to policy changes in how UAE authorities handled reports of psychological abuse and coercive control, though critics argued that more systematic changes were needed to protect vulnerable individuals from exploitation. In her prison cell that first night after sentencing, Kendra reflected on the journey that had brought her from a hopeful young woman pursuing her dreams to a convicted killer. She had come to Dubai seeking success and adventure, but instead had found manipulation, obsession, and ultimately, violence. The question that would haunt her for years to come was whether justice had truly been served. Zayyan was dead, his pattern of abuse finally ended, but at a cost that had destroyed multiple lives. Her 12-year sentence felt both too harsh and too lenient. Too harsh because it couldn't account for the psychological torture she had endured, too lenient because it couldn't bring back the man whose life she had taken. As she began her sentence, Kendra could only hope that her story might serve as a warning to other women about the dangers of losing oneself in the promise of someone else's love. She had learned the hardest possible lesson about power, manipulation, and the terrible price of revenge. The trial was over, but its implications would resonate for years to come. In exposing the sophisticated methods used by manipulative individuals to control their victims, the case had forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about power, vulnerability, and the breaking point of human endurance. Kendra Hart had come to Dubai with dreams of building a better life. Instead, she had become both victim and perpetrator in a tragedy that destroyed everyone it touched. The glittering city that had once promised her everything had taken everything in return: her freedom, her future, and her faith in the possibility of genuine love. But perhaps her story, told in its complete and terrible truth, might prevent others from walking the same path into darkness.